Thank you very much. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. So this evening marks the close of the Council's momentous 70th anniversary program season, which began last August with the founder of the Me Too movement, Tarana Burke, and has included an enormously wide-ranging set of events, from Steve Bannon to the President of Ukraine, to the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, to the chess genius and human rights activist Garry Kasparov, to the endurance record-holding astronaut Scott Kelly, the former Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano, the former Governor of New Jersey Chris Christie, the former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul, and the current CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase Jamie Dimon. And we close on a high note tonight as well. Now, we're not going to be gone and closed for long because, as you may have heard, we launch our new program season towards the end of August with the presentation of our Atlas Award to the Washington Post's former Tehran bureau chief, Jason Rezaian. An event I think that I'm really proud for us to be hosting. And then we get started in full blast on the important date of September 11th with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. I want to thank our underwriter for this evening and our long-term partner, M&T Bank and Wilmington Trust, for helping make this event possible and for their ongoing commitment to the mission of the World Affairs Council. Ira Brown, the area executive of Philadelphia and New Jersey for M&T Bank, will introduce Jim Acosta momentarily. Then Jim will make some opening remarks. He and I will sit in conversation. And finally, we'll take questions from all of you. As you, I'm sure, noticed, there are index cards and pencils at your seats. So staff will be around during our discussion to collect your questions. And I'll pose as many of them as I can to Jim towards the end of the program. With that, please welcome up Ira Brown.
Thank you, Craig. We at M&T and Wilmington Trust are likewise proud of our partnership with the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Thank you for having us here tonight. For this evening, we're delighted to be joined by CNN's chief White House correspondent, Jim Acosta, who just released a new book, The Enemy of the People, A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth in America. Everyone will be receiving a signed copy at the conclusion of today's program, and of course, we look forward to that. With both CNN and Jim specifically being frequent targets of passionate criticism by President Trump, Jim's book is an inside account of what it's like to practice journalism in the Trump White House. I'm sure we're all here for an interesting night tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jim Acosta.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. You guys can hear me okay? Am I on? You can hear me all right? Thank you very much this evening for being here. I'm not debating Steve Bannon, I hope. That's not what this announcement was, I hope. I'm going to come charging in. I really appreciate the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for inviting me to speak with all of you this evening. Thank you, Ira, for that introduction. I just want to get out of the way here. As a Washington Nationals fan, I'm still very upset with the Phillies for stealing Bryce Harper away from us. We're not going to let that get in the way of a great discussion this evening, but I had to point that out. I'm sorry. But thanks very much for inviting me here to the city of brotherly love. Now, I must say, I do appreciate this organization's mission, which is stated very clearly on your website. That is, democracy demands discourse. And I think that message is important perhaps now more than ever. The health of our democracy, I would argue, very much depends on the health of our discourse. One of the great citizens of Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin, once said, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freedom of speech." In other words, you can't have liberty without freedom of speech. Now, I don't believe we've quite reached that point just yet. Our freedom of speech hasn't been all the way subdued, but the guardrails of our democracy are pretty banged up these days, it seems. But I think we could take comfort in the fact that they're not yet broken. Still, as I write in my book, The Enemy of the People, A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth in America, we are facing unprecedented challenges in the press. Before I get into some of that, Let me take you back to a press conference at the White House in February of 2017. You knew I was going to go over some of the highlights. I had asked the president about his attacks on the press and whether they were undermining our democracy and the faith in the news media among the American people. He was upset with our coverage, and true to form, the president called me very fake news. Now, what is strange, as I write in my book, is that right after that news conference was over, I received a phone call from one of the president's top aides, Hope Hicks. And she said, "Jim, the president just wanted you to know he thought you were very professional today." And said, "Jim gets it." And I thought, wait a minute, he just went off on me in front of the cameras, but off camera, I'm very professional. It occurred to me that Trump's attacks on the press at that time were part of an act, like something from his days on reality television, something other officials and advisors confirmed to me. But the next day after that press conference, Trump escalated his attacks on the press and called the American news networks, including CNN, the enemy of the American people. As I lay out in my book, the president's anti-media rhetoric has gotten out of his control. My colleagues and I in the press are now routinely on the receiving end of death threats and other threatening messages. We at CNN and in the White House press corps have tried to warn the president and his team that this kind of language can be dangerous, but our appeals for decency have fallen on deaf ears. Trump is not going to stop calling us the enemy, I'm afraid, until somebody gets hurt. And who knows after that? Let me take you back to last fall when I was at a Trump rally in Montana before the midterm elections. At the rally, the president praised that state's lone congressman, Greg Gianforte, whose claim to fame is that he once body slammed a journalist. That actually happened, named Ben Jacobs, who at that time was working for the Guardian newspaper. Trump whipped that rally into a frenzy when he declared that Gianforte was his kind of guy. The crowd went wild. They cheered, and as I looked over to one group of young men, one of them looked back at me and started making body slam gestures. And then he ran his thumb across his neck like he wanted to slit my throat. All along, his buddies were laughing and cheering. This is not the first time I have felt threatened at these rallies. As you've probably seen, there are a number of YouTube videos out there of people directing the worst kinds of insults at me and my colleagues in the press corps. Fortunately, we are protected by what we lovingly call in the press our cage, as in the bike racks that are lined up around our filing area for our protection. At these rallies, the crowds have chanted "CNN sucks" or "Go home, Jim." We've been called scum, traitors, and worse. The atmosphere is so intense and so volatile, we often have to race back to our cars after these rallies are over. And yes, on our way back to our cars, we are still hearing those insults as we are just trying to get inside of our vehicles and go back to our hotel room. Now, I have covered 4 presidential elections and 2 administrations, and I must tell you, I have never seen this happen before. But we in the Trump press corps got a sneak preview of this behavior during the campaign. Trump would call us the dishonest news media, the disgusting media, liars, scum, and criminals, and so on. The crowds would go wild. That's because some of the people at these rallies were and still are enthusiastic consumers of this kind of rhetoric. I remember seeing a T-shirt at one of these rallies that said, "Rope, tree, journalist, some assembly required." This verbal abuse, this threatening rhetoric, this climate of fear for the press continues to this day. And what does this affect around the world? Now there are other leaders in other countries across the globe referring to stories they don't like as fake news. Earlier this year, as a matter of fact, the president of Brazil did just that, using the term fake news in the Rose Garden of the White House. But we're facing more than just taunts and name-calling. It has become, as I said, a dangerous time to tell the truth in America. There is no event I can remember that captures this war in terms of a threat to American journalists than the self-described Trump supporter who sent pipe bombs to CNN and various Democratic officials before the midterms last fall. Before his arrest, this individual made a number of threats directed at me, which I didn't realize until after he was captured in a white van covered in anti-media signage. His tweets to me said, "I was next," and that I was the enemy of America. To make his point, he tweeted out a grisly image that is just too awful to talk about in this kind of civilized setting. But as the president of CNN said in a statement about the attempted bombing of our headquarters in New York, The president's words matter. This toxin that has been injected into our political discourse appears to be spreading every day. Much of the bullying and intimidation is filtered down into social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. These platforms have become a new frontier in the intimidation and bullying of my colleagues in the press. The deluge of comments flooding into various social media accounts is truly disturbing. Last summer, I asked the press secretary, and you may remember this, Sarah Sanders, whether she agreed with the president that the press is the enemy of the people. At the time, she refused to disagree with the president. She instead pointed to the verbal abuse she has received and moved on to the next question. That was not good enough for me, so I got up and I walked out of that room. After the midterms, White House officials took their hostility to the next level, revoking my press pass after my aggressive questioning of the president. You might remember this too. Sanders tried to make her case for this action by tweeting out a doctored video of that moment when an intern tried to retrieve my microphone. The Trump-appointed judge hearing our case was not buying it. He restored my press credentials and described that video as being of, quote, questionable accuracy. And let's see, do I have it? I brought it with me tonight. Here it is, right here. I still have it. It's not going anywhere. It's staying with me at all times. I do hold it a little tighter to my chest now. But make no mistake, the journalists at CNN and our colleagues in the press are not going to be smeared, we're not going to be bullied, and we're not going to be stopped when it comes to asking the hard questions. I think a big part of the challenge the press faces today is that we've become fact checkers in real time. Much of our time and energy is devoted to fact checking the president. That, I'm sure, creates the impression that we're always giving him a hard time when we're just trying to set the record straight. A new kind of president requires a different kind of playbook for journalists and for citizens too. But look at the data. The Washington Post fact checker recently reported that President Trump has made approximately 10,000 false or misleading statements since taking office. 10,000. The president and his supporters have tried to explain all of this away with some mind-bending one-liners, such as, the truth isn't truth. And as the president once said to me, there's no proof of anything. He said that. There's no proof of anything. This is why I believe reporters don't just exist to do the news anymore. We're also here to defend the truth. Now, this doesn't sit well with Trump. You may have heard the president call me fake news. He's called me that a few times. But I've picked up on something covering this president. Each and every time he's called me fake news, we were onto something. Something called the truth. Now imagine the alternative. Imagine what life would be like if the only trusted news source were the government, mandating what's reported and controlling what is deemed to be the truth. I visited places like that. They are not the United States of America. Consider the case of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was living in the U.S. and was killed by Saudi operatives in a consulate in Turkey. Remember what the Saudi government initially said, that he walked out of that consulate. Then the kingdom changed its story and told the president rogue killers were to blame, as if O.J. Simpson were writing the press releases. Then the Saudis said it was a fist fight that got out of control, a fist fight that ended with Khashoggi's body being dismembered. That's an example of the government, the Saudi government, lying to the people and creating its own version of the truth. But we can't control that. We don't live in Saudi Arabia. The kingdom decides what the truth is there. But here in the United States and in places like Philadelphia, one of the cornerstones of our democracy, we can still ask the hard questions and we can decide what the truth is. Right after I got my credentials back, I pressed Trump on his decision to side with the Saudis in the case. I asked the president whether he was letting the Saudis get away with murder. I can still do that. I can still do that here in the United States of America. Now, part of my appreciation for the freedoms we have in this country can be traced back to my father's story. My dad came to this country in 1962, 3 weeks before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and his story has always given me an appreciation for the democratic freedoms that we hold dear in this country. Back in 2016, I traveled back to Cuba, along with former President Barack Obama, and had a chance to ask Cuba's leader at the time, Raul Castro, about his government's practice of jailing political prisoners. Castro couldn't believe his ears. He wasn't sure whether the question was directed at him or Barack Obama. And then he got pretty angry with me at the time, and I won't forget the look on Obama's face. It was like, okay, Jim, I hope you can get home after this. A Cuban reporter could never get away with something like that, but a Cuban American can. Now, I'm a proud Cuban American, but I don't want America to start acting like Cuba. One thing I've learned as a reporter covering the news from Washington to Havana is this: you can't speak truth to power if those in power are crushing the truth. Just because we are pro-truth doesn't mean we are anti-Trump. Here in the city of brotherly love, let us remember Ben Franklin's words, which resonate today. Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freedom of speech. If children are ripped from their parents at the border, our freedom of speech must not be subdued. If the president refuses to tell the truth, our freedom of speech must not be subdued. If reporters are to be labeled the enemy of the people, our freedom of speech must not be subdued. Let's exercise that precious right when we say this: we are not the enemy of the people. CNN is not the enemy of the people. Jamal Khashoggi is not the enemy of the people. Our colleagues here in the press in Philadelphia are not the enemy of the people. We are defenders of the people. I am not your enemy. You are not my enemy. We are all on the same team. We are all Americans. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Now that I've gotten that out of the way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you say that being the defender of the truth does not make you necessarily the opponent of the president.
Right.
But I will tell you that there are reasonable people that I know who did not vote for the president, who tell me they can't watch CNN anymore, that they see it as a kind of partisan mirror image of what they see as the Fox constant defense of the president. What do you say to those people?
Well, I would say this, and I've never been involved in any planning meeting or anything like that, any news organization that I've ever worked at in my entire life, where we sit down together and we say, let's really go after the president or the governor or the mayor or any elected official. We're just not wired that way. We're wired to do the news. Now, I'll just tell you about my daily existence these days, because it is a little different than how it used to be. I wake up in the morning and I look at my phone to see what the president has tweeted. And often when I do that, that tweet or that series of tweets, it may be a series of tweets that started very early in the morning, is factually challenged. Now, I'm being diplomatic. Let's just state that from the get-go, I'm being diplomatic here. Other folks would call those falsehoods. Other folks would call those lies. Am I comfortable calling things lies or saying the president is lying about something? As a journalist, I'm not really comfortable doing that. It is really tough, I think, to get a lot of journalists to agree to using that kind of terminology, because I think as members of the press in this country, we were banging up against decades of tradition where you held the presidency in high esteem and high regard. And my goodness, nobody wants to go around calling the president a liar or saying he's lying about this and that. But my goodness, when you get to a point when there are 10,000 false or misleading statements in the first 2 years in office, I think at some point it's okay to say some of these things are lies. If you keep repeating the same falsehood over and over again, and the record has been corrected, and you mentioned reasonable people, I would argue there are reasonable people working in the press, have concluded time and again that some of these things are false. I think at that point you're getting into the territory of a president of the United States lying to the American people. Now, when we're on the air all day long and we're reporting on this unprecedented administration, yes, we do have to correct the record. Can you imagine a world if we didn't correct the record and we just let these whoppers stand for 2 years? What would be our sense of reality? What would be our sense of the truth? And so we are grappling with just how to cover the unique nature of this presidency. But I will tell you that I defend the job of the press in this country to, at the very least, make sure that the American people are getting accurate, reliable, truthful information. And sometimes the truth hurts. And I get that some people think, oh gosh, you guys are really going after Trump. But I mean this when I say this, and I've said this in a number of places. Just because you were pro-truth doesn't mean you're anti-Trump.
So I want to explore the issue of fake news versus real news.
Yeah.
the term fake news really gained widespread currency first among opponents of the president who were looking for a way to describe unedited stories on social media, conspiracy theories like Pizzagate,
Right.
and so on.
Yeah, write about that in the book, yeah.
And then the president essentially co-opted the term to use against stories he doesn't like, stories he doesn't agree with. Do you have a definition of fake news? What do you see out there that you would call fake news?
Well, it certainly ain't me. That's for starters. And I'm glad you mentioned that because the term has been twisted, and it's been used as a way to go after the press with a meat axe. It started off, the term fake news pertained to stories like the Pizzagate thing, this wild, false conspiracy theory. I won't even get into the details of it because it's just so heinous. Those are the kinds of things that you would refer to as fake news. And the president, on the day that he called me fake news, I didn't get into this story in my speech, but the day that he called us that, why did he say that? What were they talking about? Well, just that day, CNN was reporting that the President of the United States had been approached by the U.S. intelligence community and told, Mr. President, the Russians may have compromising information on you. You might want to watch out for this. This may affect your presidency. Now, did that briefing occur? Yes, it is a thing that happened in the real world. It's an actual thing that happened. Reporting on the existence of that, I believe, is doing the news. Now, the president came in there, and I tried to ask him a question. He wouldn't take a question from me, and he said, your organization's terrible, and so on. Then he said, you're fake news. Now, my feeling on this is that it's sort of like you're fired from his days on The Apprentice. It was sort of a catchy way of going after somebody. But it really is a twisting of a term to go after the press for stories that he doesn't like. And he even admitted one time to Leslie Stahl from CBS, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, you may have seen this, he once admitted to Leslie Stahl of CBS that he does this to go after the press for stories that they report that he doesn't like, to essentially beat us down and intimidate us and bully us so we don't report on things that he doesn't like. And so it's a tactic, and I think folks need to be aware of that.
So what's the responsibility when mainstream media organizations do report things that turn out not to be true? So the Steele dossier was released in its entirety.
Yeah.
And there are a number of allegations that were made in that, including the idea that Michael Cohen went to Prague to pay Russians to hack that have not been substantiated, certainly weren't borne out in the Mueller report. But for 2 years, that was reported.
CNN did not report the details of that dossier, though. There were other outlets that did.
Right.
At the time when Trump got mad at us and called us fake news, as a matter of fact, we were showing some restraint that day and did not report the details of that dossier. Now, there are some details in that dossier that have been proven to be accurate, and so we don't want to, make too much of a two-dimensional characterization here. But I think that what separates us from the president and this administration is that when we screw up, we clarify, we correct the record. When's the last time you saw the president or Sarah Sanders or Sean Spicer say, oh, by the way, we got that one wrong, we screwed up that one? Doesn't happen. So you get 10,000 false or misleading statements, 0 corrections, 0 clarifications. I think maybe after Helsinki, you could count that as perhaps a clarification. As I wrote in the book, when the president came back from Helsinki, Kellyanne Conway told me this on the record, the president didn't even realize that he had screwed up. And then that was when they went and clarified his statement, and he went out and made that additional statement about it. But I would hold up our record of truthfulness and honesty against their record any day of the week.
So a significant portion of the American people having a sort of low regard for the mainstream media predates Trump by a lot.
Man, this is a love fest. I love where you're going with
yes.
this is wonderful.
We're here for discourse.
Yeah, that's right. Donald Trump would have yelled at you by now, just FYI.
Absolutely.
No, not that idea. I'm just kidding.
As you know, there are roots that go back long before the president. Some people would argue that is because even when there is factual accuracy behind everything being reported, that there is that it's all within a context of a kind of adversarial and sort of negative approach to government. I want to give you a thought experiment.
Sure.
Right? We just celebrated the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And it was celebrated as one of the greatest triumphs ever. So again, I have friends who've said to me, you know, if D-Day had CNN on the beaches, what people would have heard would have been that it was a catastrophe, that more Americans died from drowning than from enemy fire, that not a single unit landed where it was supposed to or advanced on schedule, and that all of those statements would have been factually accurate. But nonetheless, they would have been a partial truth, but not the whole truth.
Wow.
And they would have created an impression that is at odds with certainly how we remember the event historically. So I'm asking you about the sort of overall tenor of particularly broadcast journalism, and whether or not there is a kind of an adversarial and a negativity that's built in with respect to government that turn people off.
Yeah, and let me just start with the comment that we don't know for a fact that CNN would have reported it that way. And I think that is reflective of the negativity and the hostility that's been directed at us. You know, people will ask me from time to time, well, why is the media held in such low regard? Well, gee, the President of the United States calls us fake news and the enemy of the people almost on a daily basis now. So what would you expect that to be of us right now, that image to be of us right now? I think that he bears some responsibility for that. I think over the course of the last couple of decades, I think we have been fairly responsible in how we've covered military actions taken by this government. And I think, if anything, we haven't been scrutinizing or critical enough. Remember the Iraq War in the mid-2000s. What was the knock on the press? That we didn't do enough of a job to investigate whether or not there were weapons of mass destruction held up as a false premise to lead this country to war. And so that's a blot on our record, too, for not being aggressive enough. And I write about this in the book. Walter Cronkite famously went to Vietnam in the late 1960s, and this was the most trusted man in America, the anchor of the CBS Evening News, and he looked at the situation there, came back, and he didn't say, well, on one side, things are going okay in Vietnam, and on the other side, things are not going. No, Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, said the Vietnam War cannot be won. We're at a stalemate. And Lyndon Johnson, the president at that time, said, well, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost middle America. Now, we are here to tell the American people not just the truth, but also painful truths. And sometimes the truth hurts. And I will point, since you mentioned D-Day, I will point something out. And this is worth a Google. If anybody would like to Google this, as I say to my kids, it's worth a Google. What was the headline that day on my reporting on the D-Day speech that Donald Trump gave? Do you remember what that was, Craig?
I don't.
The reporting was Jim Acosta praises Donald Trump's speech at the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Has anybody heard this or seen this? Or that ain't fake news, folks. That ain't fake news. I actually got on the air and I said, you know what, that was a pretty good speech. He sat there and appraised those veterans of the D-Day invasion and so on. And I guess it took so many people by surprise and astonished people that and I'm not trying to toot my own horn here or talk about myself, but like Fox News literally wrote a headline, about it. So it's interesting that you bring up D-Day and whether we're overly negative, because on that day, maybe I was overly positive, because as it turns out later on that evening, he sat down with Laura Ingraham, and what did he do with the gravestones of the D-Day veterans and the heroes of D-Day behind him? He trashed Nancy Pelosi. He trashed Robert Mueller, the special counsel, a combat veteran, in front of gravestones in Normandy. Now, did I know that when I said he gave a great speech that night? No, I didn't. I didn't know that. I did say at the time, well, he is speaking with Laura Ingraham or whatever her name is, and let's see what he says. I did say that during the course of that live shot. But so sometimes a guy came up to me on the train the other day after that live shot that I did and said, "You guys never say anything positive about this president." I'm thinking in the back of my mind, I literally just said something positive about him. So unfortunately, we're caught in a situation now where we're not really pleasing anybody. But listen, if you wanted to be loved, I tell folks from time to time, if you want to be loved, go be a veterinarian. Okay, doing what I do is not the best way to be loved. Not the first class ticket, fast track to being loved. But that's okay. But we're here to do a job. We're here to ask the hard questions. We're not here to do a commercial for Donald Trump. That's not why we're here.
So let's pursue a little bit more the famous quote from Kellyanne Conway about alternative facts, and even what you said, the president said to you, that there's no proof of anything. It's obviously those words taken in themselves are a good laugh line.
Yeah.
But I want to just dig into it a little bit. So there's in the war on truth that people, including your writings, point out is going on at this time. There's probably no higher crime than ignoring science. But isn't there implied in that a kind of distortion of what scientific knowledge actually is? Here's what I mean by that. Scientific consensus changes a lot over time. In the 1970s, you're younger than I am, but in the 1970s, there was a scientific consensus that the world was headed for a new ice age. That was caused by particulate air pollution. In the 1950s, autism, asthma, and homosexuality were mental illnesses, according to the best science of the time. Science changes.
Sure.
So how do reporters report questions where there is no absolute truth or absolute knowledge?
Yeah, it's a good question. When we report on climate change, and by the way, whenever I talk to younger folks, and even with my own kids, and I ask them, what do you think the number one most important issue facing the country and the world is today? And they'll say climate change. I think that we would be well served to listen to some of the younger folks out there who are very concerned about this and are going to have to inherit a world that is warming. The scientific consensus, and this is how we've reported it on CNN, this is how I've reported it, the scientific consensus globally is that the Earth is warming. If you look at the data over the last 2 decades, nearly all of the hottest years on record have fallen in the last 2 decades. Nearly all of the most powerful hurricanes have occurred in the last 2 decades. Now, I suppose if we get lucky, we might make a right turn and start cooling off again and won't have to worry about this anymore. But when the scientific community, the folks at NASA, for example, and I like to point this out. I once did a story, we went to the Goddard Space Flight Center in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. And there was a gentleman there who showed me all of the satellites that they have spinning around the world. And we think of NASA as they put man on the moon and they do spacewalks and they did the space shuttle program. They also study climate change. And when you look at global temperatures, when you look at the density of the ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic, there is data to be collected and gathered and analyzed. And all of the data indicates from our own scientists in our own country that the Earth is warming. And so I don't know how we can just bury our heads in the sand and ignore that and say, well, in the 1970s, we thought we were cooling. I think you have to respect science, respect scientists, and I think if we don't, we may suffer the consequences, and not just us, our kids and our grandkids. And I talk about this in the context of our political climate and the volatility that we face today. But remember when we were growing up in this country, and our parents and grandparents would say, I want to hand off to our kids and grandkids a better country than the one we found. Does anybody say that anymore? When's the last time you heard somebody say that? We don't say it anymore. Remember I guess it was just the Coca-Cola commercials? Is that all it was back in the day? I mean, we need to get back to that mentality, and not just from a standpoint of what kind of political climate we're handing off to the next generation, but also what kind of Earth we're handing off, because that's also vitally important too, I think.
So,
and I'm not trying to play to the audience here. I'm just.
You recount in the book, you've gotten the ability to look really close up at a lot of people who work in the White House. Mm-hmm. And there's been a debate, a public debate among critics of the president as to essentially whether or not it's possible to be honorable and work for this president, whether or not there are people who are saving the country by working for the president, or whether there are people who are harming the country by working for the president.
Great question.
You've seen them up close?
Yes.
Where do you stand?
I write about this in the book because the president talks about the so-called deep state, and I've been doing this for a while. if you're complaining about the deep state, you might be in deep something else. But anyway, that's something. Put that aside for a second. I've never encountered or witnessed a deep state, but what I have encountered from time to time are officials who are willing to speak to us privately, anonymously, to let us know about things that are going on inside the government so that people have accurate, reliable information as to what's going on. I talked to a senior administration official for the writing of this book who said, and this is somebody who worked in the national security realm, who said, I can't tell you for a fact that I think that the president is working on behalf of U.S. interests. And I can't tell you for a fact why he has such a strange relationship with Vladimir Putin. This is somebody who works in the national security realm, in the Trump administration. I mean, that took my breath away when I heard that. There are folks who share with us information about what's happening with the immigration situation down on the border, how a lot of what is driving the policy is some very hard right views on the immigration issue from Stephen Miller, who is one of the president's top policy advisors. But in the course of this book, I do talk to Kellyanne Conway on the record. She gave me an on-the-record interview. At one point, she said that alternative facts was a slip of the tongue. She didn't mean to say alternative facts. I thought that was interesting, so I put that in there. But she also said that she did not agree with the use of the term the enemy of the people. She also said she did not agree with family separations at the border. She said it was a violation of her Catholic faith to take children away from their parents. And so if somebody's at that high level is willing to disagree publicly, my sense is, and this is from doing a lot of reporting at the White House the last couple of years, there are a lot of folks internally who feel that way too. Now, having said all of that, not to go on for too long here, there are folks like Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, Sarah Sanders, the White House press secretary. These are folks who have been paid by the American people, taxpayer-funded spokespersons for the administration, who have gone out there and given false or misleading information over and over and over again to the American people, to the point where Sarah Sanders gets a name drop in the Mueller report. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but in the Mueller report, it says Sarah Sanders admitted to federal investigators at one point that she passed on false information to the press during a White House briefing as to why the president fired James Comey, the FBI director. Now, it's pretty bad when you show up in the Mueller report in that fashion. And so, and as I say in the book, these aren't hostages. They're not being held hostage. But I think some of these folks who work in this administration have lost sight of the fact that they work for the American people. They work for the taxpayers, not the Trump organization or Donald J. Trump. They work for us. And I think folks have lost sight of that.
So there was a report just today that the United States may be engaged in some cyber operations against Russia that are not being reported to the president. Isn't that a deep state? Shouldn't that take our breath away too? Because there could be a future president who everybody in this audience loves. Would they want the intelligence community doing things against the wishes and without the authority of the president?
Now, I can't speak to the accuracy of that report, but that should give you pause in all sorts of ways. If they're uncomfortable sharing that kind of information with the president, that may suggest that they're concerned as to what the president would do if he received that information. Now, I will tell you, this is one of the other anecdotes that I put in the book. At one point, I was told that John Kelly, the White House Chief of Staff, former White House Chief of Staff, but when he was the White House Chief of Staff, would say to aides, "You didn't leave him alone, did you?" Now, when I asked another White House official about this person said, "Oh, he just has a dry sense of humor. He's just kidding." But I went back to the official and I said, "Listen," I talked to somebody who said, he may have just been kidding. And he said, "Oh, no. John Kelly was not joking when he said that." So I don't know, is that like the Zapruder film evidence of a deep state? I think that might be a stretch. But it does underline what we've observed reporting on this administration, that there are people in the administration who are uncomfortable with how this president behaves at times.
So we have lots of great questions from our audience. I'm going to jump into those.
Right.
So this is from one of our students in the room. Question is, you say that being pro-truth doesn't mean being anti-Trump, but how can someone be pro-truth and pro-Trump if you say that the president is factually challenged?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. Corey Lewandowski, the former campaign official for Donald Trump during the campaign, I guess he was the campaign chairman or he was running the campaign. The campaign manager. He said at one time, "Don't take the president literally. Take him seriously." Well, I think you do have to take the president literally. I think if facts are going to matter, if the truth is going to matter, at some point at the end of the day, the truth needs to mean something. Now, does that mean every president before Donald Trump was always dealing with the facts and always telling us the truth? No, of course not. But other presidents didn't demonize us and call us the enemy of the people and fake news and so on because we were trying to get to the bottom of things and pursue the truth. So I do think that there is a more of a tolerance among some Trump supporters for the president's rhetoric, and that may be that's their decision, that's their choice. But I will tell you, because I get conservative critics from time to time who'll give me a hard time about things. And what I tell folks is I'm not just sitting there in the briefing room when we used to do briefings, or out there in the driveway of the White House trying to ask questions on behalf of them. I'm also thinking about the folks at home who are Democrats and independents who are saying, wait a minute, ask the question. They didn't answer the question there. Ask the follow-up question. Okay, Sarah didn't answer that reporter's question. How about the next reporter, the next reporter? So there are folks who say, yes, we're giving the president too much of a hard time. Boy, I wish they would relax and not go so hard on him all the time. But there are also lots and lots of Americans who want us to keep fighting for the truth and keep asking the hard questions, and we represent them too. We can't just lose sight of that fact. We can't let the fact that we have conservative critics who are beating up on us every day change what we do. And I think that's vitally important, and that's the approach I bring to my job.
Next question is this. Do you feel that in an ideal world, that's capitalized, in an ideal world, CNN would jettison programming like Cuomo at 9 p.m. and stick to hard news?
Okay. Well, I'm not. So this is I was going to say, I love Chris. So I'm sorry if I disagree with the person out there in the audience who feels that way. We do have 24 hours of news, so there's lots of opportunities to watch us. And I saw a talk one time that Jeff Greenfield gave down in Dallas when he was a person at CNN for a long time, anchor and pundit and so on. And he said one time, and I'll never forget this, he said, if you ever get tired of what we're saying on CNN, turn it off. Go for a walk. Listen to the birds chirp, look at the sun. Don't look directly into the sun. Somebody did that one. I won't mention who did that. But you don't look directly into the sun during an eclipse or otherwise. But we won't go too far down that road. But anyway, we'll be there when you come back. If you come back and you've taken a nice walk and you sit back down again, we'll be there. But one of the things that I explain to folks is that we've sort of become like the Netflix of news. People are binge watching us like never before, and part of it is because we can't take our eyes off of what's happening right now. But at some point, folks, you got to take your eyes off of it for your own sake. But I get that not everybody is going to be happy with everything that we do. I'm certainly not everybody's cup of tea, but we keep trying.
But isn't there a serious question buried there in terms of the evolution of news? You mentioned Walter Cronkite. The evolution of television news from a clear desire, at least, to separate opinion from reporting versus a blurring of that and an emphasis on opinion throughout much of the day.
Well, I think Chris is very committed to the news. I think all of our anchors are very committed to the news. And I do a lot of stuff with Wolf Blitzer, and I think of Wolf as our Walter Cronkite of our era. He does a very straight newscast. I'll put up what we do on a daily basis up against what they put on other networks who are in the 24-hour news business. And I'll challenge you to say that they're not doing it quite as straight as we are. There's a real serious commitment to doing the news, giving it to people straight inside CNN. The way that they supported me, for example, during my press pass case, there was no hesitation. There was no, maybe we shouldn't do this. There was no wishy-washiness. There was a real, hard, serious commitment to freedom of the press. And what did we find out in the middle of that process? Every single news outlet in Washington and around the country supported us, even Fox News. That, I think, demonstrates our commitment to the news and pursuing the truth. And, I mean, listen, it's not going to be, not every day is going to be music to the president's ears, but we're not there to be the House organ. We're there to do the news and tell the news, no matter what the headline is that day and no matter how they'd like to hear it.
So next question goes to our foreign policy focus at the World Affairs Council. Question says, the world's moving away from unilateral world order. American foreign policy is at a critical point, but it is not much of a focus in the 2020 presidential candidates so far or everyday discussion. What's the media's role in properly informing the people about American foreign policy and world affairs?
Well, I think it's extremely important, and I think that you're going to see an increased focus on that here in the coming weeks. Some of the debates are starting, and I think you're going to see foreign policy questions. One of the things that I've encountered traveling around the world with this president is, it's very interesting to see how American alliances have shifted somewhat away from our typical allies and partners with NATO and toward more autocratic governments like China, like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, and so on. And it has at times really startled me out on the world stage to see the president fighting with Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau, while at the same time cozying up to the likes of the Saudi royal family and Vladimir Putin and saying that he's in a love affair with Kim Jong-un. I mean, those are the things that he has said. And, I talk about this in the book. I talked with various diplomatic officials who said they're concerned about this too. And, during one overseas trip the president had last year, one of these diplomatic officials told me that behind the scenes they were trying to remind the president of the importance of NATO. Now, to me, that is something that shouldn't need to happen. To me, it's when you walk into the Oval Office on day one, there should be an ironclad commitment to NATO. What is a continuing story that we've reported on time and again throughout this administration? Does Donald Trump support NATO? What's the deal with NATO? Why is that going on? And I think that it's a reasonable thing to ask why the President of the United States seems to be cozying up to autocrats and so on more so than he is our own allies. Now, the President's supporters will say, and his defenders will say, the way the president has criticized members of NATO has gotten them to contribute more money to their defense budgets and so on, and that helps strengthen NATO. Okay, fine, we'll give him that one. But at the same time, as we were saying before, the president's words matter. You shouldn't be, causing our allies and partners on the world stage to call into question America's commitment to these long-standing alliances. And one of the things, I just recently talked to a diplomatic official about this down in Washington. They invite me over from time to time to see what the heck's going on. They're really worried about the spread of these hyper-nationalist, ultra-nationalist movements across Europe, these far-right movements that are taking hold in various countries in Europe. What does that mean for us down the road, and what's the President of the United States doing about that? I think those are all very important questions, and very important questions for these candidates, too.
Okay, the next questioner says, how responsible is the press for making Trump, for all the incessant coverage that he gets and got during the 2016 campaign?
Yeah.
So this question echoes...
This when the tomatoes come out and
Yeah, we're getting there.
the cabbage.
This question actually reflects a view. We had a program right after the election in 2016, and one of our speakers had been a media consultant for Jeb Bush.
Right.
And he said, you want to know why we lost the primary? He said, because we had $100 million to spend, which was a record, never before achieved, and Donald Trump got $2 billion of free press, $2 billion.
Yeah. Well, we didn't tell them how to spend that $100 million, by the way, but anyway, But the idea being that nobody could match the free coverage. Well, and as I say in the book, he loves the coverage but hates the scrutiny. Listen, going back to the campaign, we can talk about that. Yes, we were covering him quite a bit, but he was also the front runner almost from the very beginning of the primary process. We had to cover the front runner as the front runner. Listen, there were times when we had so much, end-to-end coverage of the rallies that a lot of factually inaccurate information got out there. What are we doing this time around? We're not showing the rallies end-to-end, and we have fact checkers come on afterwards and say, the president got this wrong here, the president got that wrong there. So I think we've learned somewhat from the coverage. I will say that my observation was during the campaign is that there was a uniformity across all of the press in terms of the coverage of then-candidate Donald J. Trump. But what I will tell you, and I write about this in the book, is the Trump folks and the president, then-candidate himself, they understood what they were doing when he was making these outrageous comments, when he was making these outlandish statements and saying things like, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. That was driving the coverage. They noticed this behind the scenes. They saw, wow, look at the way the media responds to this. Let's keep doing it. And so that's what he did. He kept doing it because he saw that it drove the coverage. Now, if the front runner on the Republican Party is saying things like John McCain isn't a war hero, or I can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, or tweeting that Ted Cruz's father was involved in the Kennedy assassination, or calling into question the nation's unemployment rate, or saying that Barack Obama wasn't born in this country, I hate to tell you, we have to cover that. That's a story. And, we're not telling these folks on the Republican side who to vote for. They're doing this on their own. And one other comment that I'll make, and I've made it at other venues, is that, Hillary Clinton's name was on the ballot, not the press. And, there were lots of questions that could be asked. You could bring in a Hillary Clinton campaign advisor, and you could say, was it such a good idea for you guys not to campaign in Wisconsin at the tail end of that race? And what was that like when the Comey letter came out? What did that do to your momentum? I mean, what I noticed as a reporter covering that race is that the momentum really came to a screeching halt for Hillary Clinton at that point and started moving in Donald Trump's direction in a way that you couldn't really see in the polling because we were right there at the very end of the race. And so there were a lot of factors involved. As I write in the book, Reince Priebus, one of the president's top advisors, was the RNC chairman, came up to me and said, didn't you think that was the end of us when the Access Hollywood tape came out? And I said, yeah, that's right. I said that on CNN. And so they didn't even think they were going to win. And so we go back and we have sort of maybe a headline news, two-dimensional view as to what occurred during that campaign. But I would argue that it was much more complicated as to why Hillary Clinton lost and Donald Trump won than, well, the media did it. I think that that's an exaggeration and it's an unfair one.
So you've already sort of leaned into this next one.
Yeah.
How will media coverage differ in 2020 from 2016? Mm-hmm. What have you learned?
Well, one of the things I'm really excited by, we just hired Daniel Dale, who has made a name for himself. For those of you who are on social media and follow him, he's a reporter from the Toronto Star and has really made a name for himself as like the ultimate fact checker of Donald Trump. I think he understands, he knows what Donald Trump says better than what Donald Trump says at this point. And he's been brought on board to do fact checking heading into the 2020 campaign. And I think you're going to see across the board a lot of fact checking going on. You're going to see less end-to-end coverage of the rallies and more fact-checking of the candidates so the American people have the truth. And I think that is going to be a real asset to voters when they go out there.
Next one says, do you agree with Bill Maher that if, that if Trump loses in 2020, he may refuse to leave?
Well, listen, I mean, we've gone from fake news to fake polling. What's next? Fake election results? He's not going to believe the outcome of the election. One of the things I wrote in the book, at the very end of it, I talked to a number of presidential scholars and historians, and Larry Sabato, who you may recognize from being on TV, he's the director of the UVA Center for Politics, and he said to me at one point, not since Nixon have I ever thought that a president would somehow carry out a coup to stay in office because he didn't trust the election results until now. That is not somebody on CNN saying that. That is a director of the UVA Center for Politics. So when you have presidential historians and scholars worried about this very thing, remember Michael Cohen said that when he was testifying up on Capitol Hill, somebody who knows Donald Trump maybe better than anybody. So it's a real concern. It's something that we're all going to have to be watchful for. But I think at the same time, I'm confident, and I talk about this in the book, I'm less worried about what they call Trump derangement syndrome than I am worried about Trump depression syndrome. I get more worried about people getting so down in the dumps that they think, well, that's it, game over, we're done for, nothing, there's no fixing this. I mean, we just saw what happened during the midterm elections. The Democrats were swept into power in the House, and I'm not saying that was a good thing or a bad thing, but we did have an election and things did change. And so people should still have confidence that when 2020 rolls around, the election will happen and democracy, I think, will be just fine. I hope. Fingers crossed.
So this member of our audience says, I'm fatigued with the unrelenting coverage of all things Trump, and I now watch the BBC for a broader view of the news.
Good.
Are there not many important and relevant stories that are just not being covered by U.S. journalists?
I will argue that we are covering foreign news. We do have a real commitment to that. We have an investigative team that's doing amazing work. Just recently, one of my colleagues, Nima Al-Bagher, ran an exclusive series of stories that's been critically acclaimed about child sex trafficking in the Middle East. That was an incredible. I mean, we devoted 5 or 6 minutes to her piece on our domestic channel, the one that everybody gets here in the U.S., CNN. And listen, folks will argue that, well, it's just all Trump all the time. I'm quite aware of what's on our air all the time because I'm doing it a lot. And there are moments when we are pulling back and seeing what's happening on the world stage. One of my colleagues, Frederick Pleiken, was reporting live from Tehran today about what's happening with Iran. And so a lot of this foreign coverage is tethered to what the president is doing from the Oval Office. And that does matter, folks. We do have to continue to report on that. But as I tell folks all the time, you have to have a steady diet. Just as you have a steady diet of food that you put in your body, you need to have a steady diet of information. And that means drawing information from a variety of sources. I would love to be able to sit here and say, just watch CNN all the time and just look at our website all the time. But what I tell folks, my recommendation is that folks should be looking at an array of information outlets. The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, yes, CNN, but also, if there are some folks out there in conservative media, fine, have at it. But also try to augment that with folks on the other side of the equation too, so you're getting a well-rounded diet of information. I think that that's reasonable.
Who do you think wrote the anonymous New York Times op-ed about the president?
I try to take a stab at that with this. I have all sorts of theories. I just don't think it would be a good idea for me to speculate about that because I could say the wrong person, and then we'll find out tomorrow. Oh, the op-ed was so and so, and then I'll have egg on my face. Let me take a pass on that one if that's okay.
Okay. What is the one question that you would want an honest answer from President Trump if you could get it?
Interesting. Well, Dan Rather asked me, I did a talk with Dan Rather the other day, and he said, if the president extended his hand of friendship and said, Jim, if you give me a break, I'll give you a break, can we do that? And I said, well, my response would be, can I take your word for it? So I think one of the questions, oh gosh, now I'm publicizing it. Is this going to be streamed? And I don't want to give it away.
It'll be on YouTube tomorrow.
It'll be on YouTube tomorrow. I would love to know what he thinks about Michael Cohen going to prison. And after covering up some of the things that he covered up. He essentially went to prison for covering things up on the president's behalf. And yes, Michael Cohen made his own choices, and he's in prison, and he has to pay for that. But I don't know if we've really asked Donald Trump that question. And somebody recommended to me the other day, that I asked him about the Washington Post fact checker saying that he's uttered 10,000 false or misleading statements. What do you have to say to that? And my sense of it is he'll say that the fact checkers are fake news. But those are a couple of the things that are on my mind. But I also think a more open-ended, I used to call it the Larry King approach, where he would say, and it just asks sort of an open-ended question and see where the person takes you. I would like to know what kind of country Donald Trump thinks he's handing off to the next generation. Because my sense of it is the hostility, the volatility is to the point where we are at each other's throats right now in this country. We should not have a situation in this country where it's okay for the president to refer to the press as the enemy of the people, or this segment of the population as the enemy of the people. That to me is way outside the bounds of normal, acceptable presidential behavior. And people say, "Oh, Jim, you're just getting on your soapbox there. You're being an advocate or so on." It's hard to stay in your lane as a straight news reporter when the president of the United States is running you off the road. And my sense of it is that we've got to get back to a place where we have a little more faith in one another. And that goes for the people, the folks who are wearing the red MAGA hats and the folks wearing the pink resist t-shirts. This is not the country that I grew up in, what we're witnessing right now. And I feel very strongly about that. And it's the reason why folks want to ask me, why did you write this book? We didn't really get into this. So the reason why I wrote this book is this is not the United States of America I grew up in. We did not treat each other this way 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, where we were ripping people to shreds and ripping each other to the shreds. And my question is, and I asked this question towards the end of this book, where do we end up at the end of all of this? Right after I got my press pass back, somebody put out a tweet that said, "Kill Jim Acosta." And at that moment, CNN said, "That's it, that's enough. You're getting around-the-clock security at your house." And I was out there in the front yard of my house throwing a football with my son with a guy 50 feet away from me with a gun on his belt because I needed security just to throw the football in the front yard with my son. Is that the country that we want to hand off to the next generation? And the question that I ask in my book is, how much worse is it going to get? What happens after that? When does it go from words to reality? And you might say, "Well, Jim, you're getting on your soapbox," or "Jim, you've gone too far this time," or "We're tired of hearing your voice," or whatever. But I put this out there. What kind of country are we handing off to the next generation when what we're seeing right now is deemed acceptable? I would argue it's not.
So you refer to this in the book, but you can elucidate, obviously, for our audience. Question is, what are ways in which other members of the White House press corps have stood up for you and other colleagues, and what kind of sense of collective action has there been?
Well, as I write about, on that day that we had that press conference where the president said, "You're terrible, you're a bad human being, you're the enemy of the people," I did have somebody in the press corps stand up for me that day, and that was Peter Alexander with NBC. I feel like I'm giving everything away in the book, but anyway, as I write in the book, I really see him as the hero that day because, it has been sort of a criticism of the press corps that maybe we haven't stood up for one another quite as much. We've been so busy being competitive with one another that we haven't done that enough. And Peter at that moment could have just watched Trump go off on me, but he stood up and he said, "No, Mr. President, Jim is a hardworking, diligent reporter, bust his butt." He said "butt" in front of the president. I was like, "Okay, Peter, I guess that's okay." Grand scheme of things, a lot worse has been said, but I really appreciated that. And, with my press pass case, as I said earlier, we had just about every news outlet, including Fox News, on our side. And at one point, somebody with the White House Correspondents Association went to Sarah and said, taking away Jim's press pass is about the best way to unite the White House press corps as you could possibly imagine. And that's what we had. And that was one of the things that was said to the judge hearing our case, is that the entire White House press corps is arguing on our behalf. And one of the things I talk about, and I try to go back and remind folks of what happened during this court case, The Justice Department's own lawyers, your taxpayer-funded lawyers on behalf of the Justice Department, were arguing in the courtroom of the United States government that the President of the United States can go up to any news outlet and tap them on the shoulder and say, "You're out of here. I don't like the story that you did last night, or I don't like the reporting that you do." That is the argument that was being made on behalf of you, the taxpayers, that the President had that kind of power. Now, as I write, what would have been the situation had we lost that case? If we had lost that case, what would have been the situation? I would argue there would have been a real chilling effect on news organizations around this country. Governors could have said, "I want that reporter out of here," and mayors could have said, "I want this guy out of here." And what kind of precedent would that have set for journalists in this country? And I know we're not the most cuddly, affable bunch of folks. I mean, I think I'm a pretty nice guy, but we do represent something that is a necessary component of our democracy. If you remove that component in our democracy, what are we left with? We are left with the government telling us what is true, what is false, what is real, what is fake, and we just can't have that kind of situation happening in this country. If we care about it, we can't have that kind of situation happening.
Okay, we're getting through them. So one of our attentive viewers of yours asks this question. Why ask Sarah Sanders what she believes? She's not the story.
Yeah.
Isn't that baiting and trying to create a story? She's simply there to be the president's spokesperson.
Well, that's a really good question. And I asked Kellyanne Conway on the record, well, is it okay for the president to call us the enemy of the people? And she said, "Oh, I don't agree with that. I don't think we should call the press the enemy of the people." So I did ask her opinion on that day, as she is paid, her salary is paid for with our tax dollars after all. White House press secretaries have come and gone, and they've said from time to time, "I don't speak on my behalf, I speak on behalf of the president." But when I asked Sarah Sanders that day, "Do you agree with the idea that the press is the enemy of the people?" I was trying to get her point of view, I guess. But remember, earlier in the day, Ivanka Trump said she didn't agree with the president saying that the press is the enemy of the people. So his own daughter was saying that. But the reason why I asked that question is, and when we had White House briefings, we could do this. You had the cameras on, you had the stenographer there with the microphone and the tape recorder and so on. This is all preserved. Yes, it makes headlines now, and yes, it's on Twitter and everything else, but this is now preserved. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, students can go back and look at the White House website, unless bad things happen and they just clean it out and it's not there anymore, but the transcripts are there, and those are operated by news organizations. It will always be preserved from here on out that the White House press secretary refused to disagree with the concept that the press is the enemy of the people. And that is the reason why I asked that question that day. I wanted it on the record and preserved so future generations can look back and say, this was a moment when not just the President of the United States, but a spokesperson on behalf of the United States government was saying, the press is the enemy of the people. And I think we should be thinking deeply about that as to whether or not that's acceptable. My view is, and I wrote this book, and you may be getting it tonight, and it might just be an expensive paperweight for you. But I hope that folks will read through this and think about this, because if after they call us the enemy of the people, who's next? What segment of American life will it be acceptable next to refer to as the enemy?
Two last questions, both looking towards the future. First question is, look into your crystal ball for a moment. Forward to 2021, will Donald Trump be reelected?
I got it wrong the last time.
And who, if anyone from his administration, will be going to prison?
Oh, gosh. Wow. Gee, my PR person's saying, it's time to go. We gotta go. There's a train to catch. As I said, and I give my colleague Sarah Murray credit for this, she was also a Trump campaign reporter, and she predicted that he was going to win. And I thought, there's no way you can get away with saying all of the things that he said, and there's no way you can get away with that Access Hollywood business and get elected president of the United States. No way, no how, it ain't going to happen. Take it to the bank. And then I was proven wrong. So I'm out of the prediction business. So I won't say at this point, but I will point to some data and some metrics, and that is, and this goes back to Trump depression syndrome. In the midterm elections, I think that the Senate was tilted in the favor of the Republicans. The Senate battleground map was tilted in favor of the Republicans. They were able to eke out, I think, 1 or 2 extra seats as a result of the midterms. But in the House, there was a blue wave. Remember that night on the various cable networks, we were starting to say, oh, it looks like a blue wave, and then all the trolls and taunters on Twitter would say, you people, you knuckleheads in the media, you're falling for this nonsense that it's a blue wave. Well, the Democrats did win 40 seats in the House, and it went to the Democrats. That, to me, is the definition of a blue wave. But having said that, the other thing that I'll point you to is there was an 8 percentage point advantage for the Democrats in a midterm election. And midterm elections are typically the kind of elections that favor Republicans. For folks who follow this casually or even intently like I do, we know that midterm elections typically favor the Republicans. And so for a midterm election cycle that typically favors the Republicans, to go 8 points in the direction of the Democrats, I think is a pretty resounding victory for the Democratic Party. And it speaks to me that the president faces a very big uphill challenge going into 2020. Now, I've completely dodged that question and not said who I think is going to win, but I do think he does face an incredibly big uphill challenge. Now, in terms of who's going to go to jail next, I mean, yeah, you're just trying to bait me, you know. I think that, listen, I didn't think there would be this many. There's been a heck of a lot of folks going to jail. The president's campaign chairman, president's national security advisor is now awaiting sentencing. I guess he hasn't yet. The president's former personal attorney, other campaign officials. And, you know, that is something that I think the American people are going to have to weigh heading into 2020. Is that, you know, the kind of record for, you know, good government that you want to see for another 4 years?
Okay, last question. It goes right to the end of your book.
Yeah.
Is it possible to put the genie back in the bottle and have a meaningful, reasonably respectful relationship between the government and the press in the future?
I think so. I think the next administration, Republican or Democrat, the next president, Republican or Democrat, will very likely have a higher appreciation for what we do, more respect for the press, and I think you're going to see the temperature come down. You know, our democracy has sort of a self-cleaning oven feature, and as Winston Churchill used to say, you know, the American people eventually do the right thing after exhausting all other options. I thought that was pretty dead on. I think that's pretty dead on. I think that, yes, I think it will go back. But remember, I mean, when Barack Obama was president, there were tensions with the press, and same with George W. Bush and Bill Clinton and so on. That's not going to go away. But what needs to go away, and I think that I feel like I'm well within my lane as a straight news reporter saying this, we need to get away from the kind of rhetoric where we refer to the press or any segment of the American people as the enemy of the people. I will, you know, leave this earth feeling this for the rest of my life. I mean, I feel as though we've crossed a bright line in that regard. And I think, and I write about this in the book, it's something that he's lost control of. It started off as taunting and trolling and an act and kind of like you're fired on The Apprentice and so on, and it's gotten out of control, and I hope he can reel it back in, and if not, I think 2020 will let us know whether the American people reel it back in.
Jim, thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks very much.